They weren't burned at the stake. That's the first lie most people believe. In 1692, in a quiet Puritan village in Massachusetts, fear spread faster than fire, and far more deadly. 19 people were hanged. One man was crushed to death under heavy stones. Hundreds were accused. Children testified. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Ministers hesitated. Judges condemned. But here's the real question no one asks. What if the Salem Witch Trials weren't really about witches at all? What if the true cause was political paranoia, land wars, religious extremism, or something even darker hiding beneath the surface of colonial America? And what if the people who started it never meant for it to spiral out of control? Tonight we are going beyond the hysteria, beyond the folklore, and into the hidden truth behind the Salem Witch Trials. Because once you see what was really happening in Salem, you can't unsee it. Micro cliffhanger 028. And the first cracks in the story begin with two little girls. This is a story about fear, about power, about what happens when belief overrides evidence, and suspicion becomes law. Welcome to a deep historical investigation, where we slow down the moment history textbooks rush past, and uncover the human decisions that changed everything. Tonight, we step into 1692 Massachusetts, into cold wooden houses, candlelit courtrooms, and a community on the edge of collapse. This is the hidden truth behind the Salem Witch Trials. And it begins in a village already divided long before anyone whispered the word witch. Because Salem wasn't united. It was already at war with itself. Winter 1692. Salem Village was not the charming tourist town you might imagine today. It was harsh, isolated, suspicious. New England Puritans believed the devil was real. Not symbolic, not metaphorical, real, active, touching, hunting for weak souls to corrupt. And they believed New England itself was part of a cosmic battlefield between God and Satan. This wasn't superstition, it was theology. The Massachusetts Bay Colony had been founded by Puritans fleeing religious persecution in England. They believed they were building a city upon a hill, a godly society that would serve as a model to the world. But by the late 1600s, cracks were forming. The original religious zeal was fading. Younger generations were less devout. Economic pressures were rising. Frontier wars with Native American tribes, especially King Philip's War, 1675 to 1676, had traumatized the region. Entire towns had been burned. Refugees flooded into safer villages like Salem. Among them were families who had seen violence, bloodshed, and what they believed were signs of divine punishment. And some of those refugees would later become central figures in the witch trials. Salem itself was split between two communities. Salem Town, the wealthier, more commercial port, and Salem Village, the rural farming population. The village resented the town. They argued over taxes, over church control, over land boundaries, over who held authority. By 1689, Salem Village hired a new minister, Reverend Samuel Parris. Parris was strict, rigid, suspicious, and deeply unpopular. Half the village supported him. The other half despised him. Church attendance declined. Salaries went unpaid. Public arguments erupted during meetings. This wasn't unity. This was a powder keg. Inside Parris's own home lived his daughter Betty Parris, age 9, and his niece Abigail Williams, age 11. In January 1692, during one of the coldest winters on record, the girls began behaving strangely. They screamed. They threw objects. They hid under furniture. They complained of invisible bites and pinches. Doctors were called. No physical illness could be found. So the physician, William Griggs, made a diagnosis that would change history. They are under an evil hand. In other words, witchcraft. Micro cliffhanger 520. And once that word was spoken, there was no taking it back. In Puritan belief, witches were not just spellcasters. They were traitors. They had signed a pact with the devil. And if Satan was attacking Salem village through witches, then God was testing them. The pressure was unbearable. Soon the girls were asked a terrifying question. Who is hurting you? And they answered. First, Tituba, the enslaved woman in the Paris household. Then Sarah Good, a homeless beggar. Then Sarah Osborne, a woman who rarely attended church. All socially vulnerable, all easy targets. But what no one realized yet was that this was only the beginning. Because once accusations became currency, anyone could be next. And within weeks, Salem would descend into chaos. Once the first names were spoken, there was no quiet return to normal. Tuba, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, 3 women, 3 very different lives, but all socially exposed, vulnerable, outside the tight inner circle of Salem's respectable families. On February 29, 1692, warrants were issued for their arrest. Think about that for a moment. Within weeks of a doctor's vague diagnosis, the machinery of law was already turning. This was not rumor anymore. This was official. The women were brought before local magistrates Jonathan Corwin and John Hathorne, men who believed firmly in the existence of witches. The examinations were public, crowded, intense. The accused stood in front of neighbors who had known them for years, while young girls writhed on the floor behind them, screaming that invisible specters were attacking them. Every time the accused denied the charges, the girls convulsed harder. Every time a hand was raised, the girls claimed to feel choking fingers around their throats. The courtroom wasn't looking for truth. It was looking for confirmation. And then something unexpected happened. Tituba confessed. Under pressure, likely after being beaten by Reverend Paris, Tituba told the magistrates that yes, she had seen the devil. Yes, she had signed his book. Yes, there were other witches in Salem. But she did something even more dangerous. She described a conspiracy. She claimed there were many witches, flying on poles, riding animals, plotting to destroy the Puritan colony. In a society already primed to believe Satan was attacking New England, this was gasoline on fire. The courtroom shifted instantly. If Tituba had confessed, then the devil was real in Salem. And if she said others were involved, then the hunt had to continue. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne denied everything. It didn't matter. They were sent to jail in Boston. Tituba, ironically, survived because she confessed. Confession meant cooperation. Denial meant defiance. And defiance meant danger. Within days, more accusations surfaced. Not just outsiders now. Respected church members. Property owners. Women with stable reputations. Then something truly shocking happened. Rebecca Nurse was accused. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old. Gentle, widely respected. If she could be a witch, then anyone could be. The village was no longer targeting the fringes. It was imploding inward. And this is where the trials shifted from isolated accusations to systemic crisis. By April, more than 20 people had been arrested. Jails filled across Massachusetts, not just in Salem but in Ipswich, Boston, and beyond. Chains clanked in cold stone cells. Families sold land to pay prison fees. Even the accused had to pay for their own imprisonment. And then Governor William Phips returned from military campaigns in Maine. He found a colony in chaos. So he established a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer. Translated from French, it meant to hear and determine. But what it truly meant was this: a fast-track judicial body designed to clear the backlog of witchcraft cases. The Chief Justice was William Stoughton, a man deeply convinced that spectral evidence was valid. Spectral evidence. This was the turning point. Spectral evidence meant that if someone claimed to see your spirit, your invisible specter, attacking them in a dream or vision, that testimony could be used in court. No physical proof required. No witnesses necessary. If a teenage girl screamed that your ghost pinched her, you could hang. Pause and imagine the power that gave to fear. to imagination, to vengeance. By June 1692, the first trial began. Bridget Bishop, known for wearing bright colors, for running a tavern, for not fitting the rigid Puritan mold. She denied being a witch. The afflicted girls screamed in court. Men testified they saw her specter at night. On June 10, 1692, Bridget Bishop was hanged, the first execution. The crowd watched from Gallows Hill. There was no burning stake, just a rope, tree, body, and a message. The court would not hesitate. After Bishop, the pace accelerated. 5 more were executed in July, 5 in August, 8 in September. Among them Rebecca Nurse. Even after a jury initially declared her not guilty, the judges pressured reconsideration. The verdict was reversed. She was hanged on July 19th. An elderly grandmother. At this point, the village was no longer asking if witches existed. It was asking who was next. Even more chilling, accusations began creeping toward the governor's inner circle, toward wealthy merchants, toward powerful men. Wen and Putnam Jr. and others accused the wife of Governor Phipps himself. Something shifted. Suddenly, the hysteria wasn't safely contained among farmers and widows. It was threatening authority. And when fear threatens power, power reacts. The question was no longer whether Salem had witches. The question was whether Salem's leadership had lost control. By the summer of 1692, Salem was no longer a village. It was a pressure chamber. Every conversation carried risk. Every sideways glance felt loaded. People lowered their voices in public and whispered in private. Doors were bolted earlier at night. Church attendance became both a shield and a threat, because now faith itself was under suspicion. The accused weren't confessing in large numbers anymore. Many were holding firm, refusing to admit they had signed the devil's book. And that refusal created a new problem for the court. You see, the trials depended on confession to validate the narrative. If witches confessed, then the threat was real. If they named others, the hunt justified itself. But when respected citizens stood before judges and calmly declared their innocence, it introduced doubt. And doubt was dangerous, especially for the men in power. Inside the courtroom, the performances intensified. The afflicted girls, and Putnam Jr., Abigail Williams, Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, had become central figures. Their fits were now expected, almost rehearsed. When the accused entered the room, the girls would collapse. If the accused moved their hands, the girls screamed that invisible claws were tearing their skin. Observers began to notice something strange. The fits only happened in court, or in front of specific authority figures, rarely in isolation, and never when skeptics were present. But questioning the girls meant questioning the trials. And questioning the trials meant siding with witches. So most people stayed silent, but not all. One of the first to publicly challenge the court was Reverend John Proctor. Proctor was not a fringe figure. He was a landowner, a tavern keeper, a respected member of the community. He openly criticized the proceedings, arguing that the girls were pretending, that the accusations were spiraling beyond reason. And then, his wife, Elizabeth Proctor, was accused. Shortly after, John himself was named. This was the pattern. Critics became targets. Silence became survival. The message spread quickly through Salem. Do not speak out. In private homes, families began coaching each other on how to behave. Do not roll your eyes in church. Do not mutter during testimony. Do not show frustration. Because irritation could be interpreted as guilt. Even grief could be suspicious. If your neighbor was arrested and you showed too much emotion, were you defending a witch? If you showed too little, were you hiding something? The social fabric was tearing. And beneath the surface, older tensions resurfaced. Land disputes that had simmered for years suddenly found new life in court accusations. Families who had argued over property lines now testified against each other. The Putnam family, major accusers, were aligned against the Porter family, their long-standing rivals in village politics. Historians later mapped the accusations geographically, and the pattern was unsettling. Many of the accused were connected, directly or indirectly, to factions opposing the Putnams. Was this spiritual warfare, or political cleansing? The line blurred. Even more disturbing, children began accusing adults with startling confidence. And adults listened. Imagine being a father in 1692, sitting in a wooden meeting house, while a 12-year-old girl claims your specter strangled her in the night. How do you defend yourself against a dream? How do you cross-examine a vision? Can't. And that helplessness created something deeper than fear. Created psychological submission. By late August, over 100 people were in jail. Chains rusted around wrists. Straw rotted on stone floors. Some prisoners died before trial. Yet the trials continued, because to stop now would mean admitting error. And error would mean blood had been shed unjustly. That possibility was almost unthinkable. So instead the system doubled down. But outside the courtroom, quiet resistance was forming. Ministers across Massachusetts began writing letters questioning spectral evidence. One of them, Increase Mather, issued a warning that would echo through history. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape, than that one innocent person should be condemned. It was a radical statement, because it suggested that the court might be wrong. And if the court was wrong, then everything happening in Salem was built on sand. The ground beneath the trials was beginning to tremble. Question was, would anyone powerful enough dare to pull the rope tight, or finally cut it? By early September 1692, something subtle began to change. Not in the courtroom, not yet, but in the minds of the people watching. Executions had become almost routine. Gallows Hill no longer shocked the senses the way it had in June. The sight of a body swinging in the wind, the creak of rope, the murmured prayers. They were horrifying, yes, but no longer unimaginable. And that was the most dangerous development of all. Because when horror becomes normal, conscience dulls. On September 9th, 6 more were tried and convicted. Among them was Martha Corey, a devout church member who had once questioned the legitimacy of the girl's fits. Her husband, Giles Corey, had already been arrested. And what happened to Giles would send a different kind of message to Salem. When a person was formally charged, they were required to enter a plea, guilty or not guilty. But Giles Corey refused. He stood silent before the court. Under English common law, a defendant who refused to plead could not be tried. But the court had a solution. They ordered peine fortitude, strong and hard punishment. Giles was laid on the ground. A board was placed over his body. Stones were stacked on top. More weight added slowly, deliberately, for 2 days. When asked to plead, he reportedly whispered just 2 words. More weight. On September 19, 1692, Giles Corey was crushed to death. He never confessed. He never named anyone. And he denied the court the satisfaction of a conviction. His silence was not hysteria. It was defiance. And people noticed. The brutality unsettled even those who believed witches were real. Crushing a man to death because he would not speak. This was no longer just spiritual warfare. This was state violence. At the same time, something else troubling emerged. Some of the accused began confessing, not because they believed they were witches, but because they understood the pattern. Confess and live. Deny and hang. Survival instinct replaced theological debate. Those who confessed often accused others, creating fresh waves of arrests. It was a self-feeding machine. The more names produced, the more credible the conspiracy seemed. And yet, the circle of accusation kept expanding upward, into wealth, into influence, into proximity to power. When respected Boston citizens were named, when merchants with political connections were whispered about, When even Governor Phipps's wife was accused, the trials stopped looking like righteous purification. They started looking unpredictable. And unpredictability threatens authority more than rebellion ever could. Governor Phipps had been absent during much of the escalation, focused on frontier conflicts. But reports were reaching him now. Letters from ministers. Murmurs from Boston elites. One of the most significant came from Increase Mather and his son, Cotton Mather. Cotton had initially supported the trials, though cautiously. But Increase was increasingly vocal against the use of spectral evidence. His argument was devastatingly simple. The devil could assume the shape of an innocent person. If that were true, then spectral evidence proved nothing. It meant Satan could be manipulating the court itself. Imagine the implication. If the devil could mimic the innocent, then the trials might be condemning the very people God wished to protect. That theological loophole struck at the heart of the proceedings. Suddenly, the foundation wasn't solid divine justice. It was uncertainty. And uncertainty spreads fast. In taverns and meeting houses, whispers grew bolder. What if we are wrong? What if this is personal? What if this is fear dressed as righteousness? Meanwhile, the jail cells were overflowing. Prisoners chained in freezing conditions as autumn approached. Families bankrupt from prison fees. Crops left untended. Businesses abandoned. The economic strain alone was becoming unsustainable. Salem wasn't just spiritually fractured. It was financially bleeding. And here was the unspoken fear. If too many prominent families were damaged, the entire colony could destabilize. This was no longer about village drama. It was about governance. And when governance feels threatened, it reacts. But how? Would the authorities double down to prove strength? Or would they quietly begin dismantling the machine they had built? Because by mid-September, the rope was still swinging. And the next names on the list were no longer powerless widows. They were connected. By late September 1692, the machinery of accusation was still running, but it was no longer running smoothly. It was grinding against doubt, grinding against exhaustion, grinding against the growing realization that something had gone too far. On September 22nd, 8 more people were hanged. Among them was Martha Corey and Mary Easty. Mary Easty had done something remarkable before her execution. She wrote a petition, not begging for her life, not demanding mercy, but pleading that no more innocent blood be shed. She asked the court to carefully reconsider the evidence being used. She asked that others not suffer as she was about to suffer. It was a quiet, dignified act of resistance. And then she was led to the gallows. By this point, 19 people had been executed by hanging. 1 crushed. Several had died in prison. Over 200 accused. The scale alone was staggering for a small colonial community. And yet, something strange was happening behind the scenes. The afflicted girls, the central engine of the trials, were becoming less predictable. Their fits were still dramatic, but they were also starting to lose their edge. Some observers noticed inconsistencies, delays, moments where the performance didn't quite align. Even more unsettling, accusations were beginning to stretch credibility. When a former minister, George Burroughs, was arrested and tried, it sent shockwaves through the colony. Burroughs had once served as Salem's minister years earlier. He was educated, articulate, physically strong. During his execution on August 19th, he did something that froze the crowd. He perfectly recited the Lord's Prayer, flawlessly. In Puritan belief, witches were believed incapable of reciting the Lord's Prayer correctly. The crowd murmured. Some began to question, was a witch capable of speaking sacred words so clearly? Cotton Mather, who was present, urged the crowd not to be swayed by appearances. The devil, he warned, could disguise himself as an angel of light. That explanation held for a while. But seeds of doubt had been planted, and doubt once planted grows. By early October, The accusations were striking dangerously close to the colony's elite networks. Merchants in Boston, relatives of officials, people whose economic influence mattered. Governor Phipps, now fully aware of the expanding crisis, faced a choice: continue the trials and risk destabilizing the colony's leadership structure, or intervene and risk admitting catastrophic judicial failure. It wasn't just a moral dilemma, it was political calculus. Massachusetts was already vulnerable. The colony had recently lost its original charter and was operating under a new royal governor structure. London was watching. Instability in Salem could signal weakness to the crown, and weakness could mean intervention. So on October 12, 1692, Increase Mather's critique of spectral evidence was published. The argument was theological, but its impact was political. If spectral evidence was unreliable, then nearly every conviction rested on unstable ground. 5 days later, Governor Phipps did something few expected. He dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. Just like that, the special court that had overseen the executions was gone. Trials would continue, but under a new structure with stricter evidence standards. Spectral testimony was effectively barred. The shift was immediate. In January 1693, when the new Superior Court of Judicature convened, many of the remaining accused were acquitted. Others were released. The chain reaction that had seemed unstoppable suddenly stalled. But stopping the court did not erase what had happened. 19 bodies could not be revived. Giles Corey could not be uncrushed. Families could not reclaim lost land or reputation overnight. And perhaps most haunting, no single individual fully accepted responsibility. Judges claimed they acted in good faith. Ministers said they warned against excess. Accusers often fell silent. The hysteria had no clear villain. It was collective, systemic, built from fear, theology, politics, rivalry, trauma, and human weakness. By May 1693, Governor Phipps had pardoned the remaining accused. The jails emptied. The gallows stood unused. And Salem entered a different phase. Not chaos, not hysteria, but something quieter. Reckoning. The trials had ended, but the questions had not. Because now the colony had to confront something far more uncomfortable than witches. It had to confront itself. Now we arrive at the question that lingers like smoke after a fire. If the trials ended so abruptly, if spectral evidence was quietly dismissed, if leaders began stepping back, then what was this really about? Because hysteria alone doesn't explain precision. And fear alone doesn't explain patterns. When historians began re-examining the Salem records centuries later, something unsettling emerged. The accusations were not random. They clustered. Geographically, politically, economically. In the 1970s, historians Paul Boyer and Stephen Nissenbaum mapped the households of the accusers and the accused. What they found changed the conversation forever. Most of the accusers were connected to families aligned with Reverend Samuel Parris and the Putnam faction. Most of the accused were associated, directly or indirectly, with families tied to the rival Porter faction. This wasn't just theology. It was factional warfare. Salem Village had long been divided between those who wanted independence from Salem town and those who favored economic integration with it. The Putnams were rural power players, deeply invested in village autonomy. The Porters were more commercially oriented, connected to trade networks in Salem town. Land disputes had simmered for decades. Property lines were contested. Inheritance cases were bitter. And now, under the cover of witchcraft accusations, those rivalries had teeth. When you accuse someone of witchcraft, you don't just damage their reputation. You remove them. You freeze their assets. You isolate their allies. You destabilize their network. In a fragile agrarian economy, that kind of disruption could shift power. Suddenly, the trials look less like chaos and more like weaponized belief. But that's only one layer. There was another shadow looming over Salem in 1692 war. King William's War was raging along the northern frontier. French forces and their Native American allies were attacking English settlements in Maine and New Hampshire. Refugees poured into Massachusetts, including Salem Village. Many of the afflicted girls, including Mercy Lewis, had fled frontier violence. They had seen their homes burned, family members killed, entire communities wiped out. And in Puritan theology, such disasters were not random. They were divine punishment, or satanic assault. Mary Beth Norton argues that the frontier war trauma directly shaped the psychology of Salem. The devil, in Puritan imagination, was believed to operate strongest in the wilderness. And what was the frontier? Wilderness. What was creeping closer to Massachusetts? The frontier. To many colonists, Satan was advancing geographically. And Salem Village, divided and spiritually anxious, may have believed it was the next battlefield. Now layer this onto political instability. In 1684, Massachusetts' original charter had been revoked by the English crown. The colony's autonomy was stripped. By 1692, a new royal charter was in place. Governor Phipps was not just managing a witch crisis. He was governing under fragile legitimacy. The colony needed to demonstrate order, control, moral clarity. Allowing witchcraft to spread unchecked would signal weakness, to London, to neighboring colonies, to enemies. But allowing false executions would signal incompetence. So the leadership walked a tightrope. For months they leaned into enforcement. And then, when accusations edged too close to elite circles, they pivoted. That pivot is telling. When poor women were accused, the trials accelerated. When prominent families were threatened, the trials dissolved. Power drew a boundary, and that boundary exposed something deeply human. The Salem Witch Trials were not purely religious hysteria. They were a convergence point. Religious extremism, political factionalism, economic rivalry, frontier war trauma, gender dynamics. Most accused were women, especially those who challenged social norms. And institutional fragility. No single cause explains Salem, but together they form a web. And once you see the web, you realize something chilling. The trials were not an anomaly. They were a stress test, and Salem failed. Because under pressure, fear was chosen over evidence. Authority chose validation over caution. Community chose suspicion over restraint. And when the executions stopped, the damage was already irreversible. But here's the twist that lingers longest. The people of Salem did not consider themselves irrational. They believed they were defending God's kingdom. They believed they were protecting their children. They believed they were preserving order. Which raises a dangerous question. If you were living in Salem in 1692, with your theology, your fears, your neighbors accusing each other, would you have resisted? Or would you have nodded quietly in the meeting house, convincing yourself that the rope was necessary? When the executions stopped, the silence was deafening. No public announcement declared, "We were wrong." No dramatic confession echoed through the meeting house. Instead, the gallows simply stood unused. Winter crept into Massachusetts. Snow layered over disturbed earth at Gallows Hill. The ropes were taken down. The bodies were gone. But the memory remained. And in that memory, something began to rot. The Superior Court of Judicature, established after the dissolution of Oyer and Terminer, reviewed remaining cases with stricter standards. Without heavy reliance on spectral evidence, most accusations collapsed under scrutiny. Acquittals increased. Juries hesitated. The same society that had once leaned forward eagerly in courtrooms now shifted uncomfortably in its seats. Because once the adrenaline of fear faded, reality crept back in. Neighbors had testified against neighbors. Children had condemned adults. Judges had signed death warrants. Ministers had validated proceedings. And now, the smoke cleared. One of the earliest public acknowledgments came not from politicians, but from jurors. In January 1697, 5 years after the trials began, a day of fasting and reflection was declared in Massachusetts. On that day, one of the original jurors, Samuel Sewall, stood in his church and did something extraordinary. He handed his minister a written confession. In it, he admitted personal guilt for his role in the trials. He asked for forgiveness, from God and from the community. Sewall's public repentance was rare. Most officials avoided direct admission of fault. William Stoughton, the Chief Justice who had overseen many convictions, never apologized. He maintained that the trials were legally justified based on the evidence presented. To him, the system had worked as designed. That statement is chilling, because it means Salem wasn't a breakdown of law. It was law functioning without sufficient restraint. Meanwhile, families of the executed carried grief that did not fade. Imagine being the daughter of Rebecca Nurse, knowing your mother was hanged after a reversed verdict. Imagine being a child of John Proctor, your father executed after criticizing the trials. Property had been seized, reputations destroyed, debts accumulated, and in colonial society, reputation was currency. In 1697, Reverend Samuel Parris, the controversial minister whose household had ignited the accusations, was forced to resign. The village that once defended him now blamed him. But was he the architect, or simply the spark in a field already dry? In 1706, Ann Putnam Jr., one of the most vocal accusers, stood before her congregation and delivered a public apology. She was 26 years old. She claimed she had been deluded by Satan. She asked forgiveness from the families she had harmed. Her voice, once trembling with theatrical fits, now trembled with remorse. But apologies do not resurrect the dead. Over the next decades, petitions flooded the Massachusetts legislature. Families sought formal exoneration, financial restitution, official acknowledgement. In 1711, the colony passed a bill reversing the convictions of many accused witches and granting monetary compensation to their heirs. It was a bureaucratic attempt at moral repair. But even then, not all names were cleared. Some families waited centuries. In fact, the last formal exoneration related to the Salem trials did not occur until 2022. 330 years later. Let that settle. 3 centuries to fully admit error. The Salem Witch Trials became a cautionary tale almost immediately. Cotton Mather, who had once defended aspects of the proceedings, gradually shifted his tone in later writings. The colony quietly distanced itself from the episode. But what makes the climax of Salem so powerful is not just the executions. It's the realization, the dawning awareness that good people, devout people, had participated in injustice. Not out of cruelty alone, but out of conviction, out of certainty, out of fear dressed as righteousness. And that realization lingers. Because Salem forces a confrontation with a disturbing truth. Mass hysteria does not require monsters. It requires belief. It requires institutions that fail to question themselves. It requires communities willing to trade doubt for security. And in 1692, Salem had all 3. By the time the colony began to formally repent, Gallows Hill was quiet. Grass grew back. Children played nearby. Life resumed. But beneath that surface, a lesson had been carved into American memory. One that would resurface again and again. During political purges. During Red Scares. During moments when accusation outweighed evidence. Salem was not just an event. It was a pattern. And patterns repeat. When the trials ended, Salem did not collapse. It did something more unsettling. It adapted. There was no revolution. No dramatic overthrow of leadership. No sweeping purge of officials. Instead, Massachusetts slowly recalibrated its understanding of justice. And that recalibration would ripple far beyond 1692. In the immediate aftermath, the most urgent question was legal. How could this have happened within the framework of English common law? The answer was uncomfortable. The system had allowed it. Spectral evidence, though controversial, had not been explicitly outlawed at the start. Judges operated within a gray zone of theology and precedent. Magistrates leaned heavily on religious authority. What Salem exposed was not simply corruption. It exposed ambiguity. And ambiguity, when mixed with fear, becomes dangerous. After 1692, Massachusetts courts became far more cautious about intangible evidence. The reliance on dreams, visions, and spiritual testimony faded rapidly. Legal culture shifted toward material proof. Witnesses now required corroboration. Confessions required scrutiny. Gradually, a more evidence-based judicial instinct began to take shape. It wasn't immediate, but Salem planted the seed of skepticism. Over the next century, as Enlightenment thinking spread across the Atlantic, colonial America absorbed new ideas. Reason, empiricism, the rights of the accused. The Salem Witch Trials became an example whispered in debates. A warning. By the time the United States Constitution was written in 1787, safeguards had taken form. The presumption of innocence. Protection against self-incrimination. The right to confront witnesses. The prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. These principles were not drafted solely because of Salem, but Salem stood in the background as proof of what happens when procedure fails. Giles Corey's crushing death echoes in the Eighth Amendment. The chaos of spectral evidence echoes in rules about admissible testimony. The mass accusations echo in protections against mob justice. Salem helped shape American legal paranoia, in the best sense of the word. A healthy suspicion of unchecked authority. But the cultural impact may be even deeper. The phrase, witch hunt, entered the American vocabulary as shorthand for reckless accusation. Centuries later, during the Red Scare of the 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy accused government officials of communist infiltration with little concrete evidence. Journalists and politicians invoked Salem. Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible in 1953, not as a literal retelling but as allegory. The Salem Witch Trials became a mirror. A reflection Americans hold up whenever fear starts to outpace proof. And yet, Salem is often simplified. Tourist shops sell broomsticks and pointed hats. Costumed reenactments dramatize courtroom hysteria. But beneath the folklore lies something much heavier. Salem was a community under stress. A fragile society balancing theology, war, politics, and identity. When that balance tipped, justice warped. The true resolution of Salem wasn't the governor dissolving a court. It was the slow, painful recognition that institutions can fail when certainty replaces doubt. And that recognition has never fully gone away. Even today, historians continue debating causes. Was it ergot poisoning in the rye causing hallucinations? Most modern scholars dismiss that theory due to inconsistent symptom patterns. Was it purely political factionalism? That explains patterns, but not the intensity. Was it trauma from frontier war? That explains fear, but not execution speed. The reality is more complex. Salem was convergence. Multiple stress fractures aligning at once. Religion provided the framework. Politics provided the motive. Fear provided the fuel. Law provided the mechanism. And once the mechanism was activated, it ran until power felt threatened. Then it stopped. That stopping point reveals perhaps the most sobering lesson. The trials did not end purely because moral clarity prevailed. They ended when influential people were at risk. Which means injustice persisted until it threatened power itself. That realization lingers uncomfortably in modern discussions of accountability. But here's the quiet resolution that matters most. Salem did not erase its past. It documented it. Court transcripts survived. Petitions survived. Apologies were recorded. Names were restored. The community eventually chose memory over denial. And that choice, imperfect, delayed, incomplete, matters. Because remembering failure is a form of protection. For over 3 centuries, the Salem Witch Trials have stood as a warning flare in American history. Not about witches. So why does Salem still feel so close? Why does a 17th-century Puritan village continue to echo inside a 21st-century democracy? Because Salem wasn't about broomsticks. It was about psychology. Modern social psychologists use terms Salem's residents would never have known: mass hysteria, moral panic, confirmation bias, groupthink. But the mechanisms are hauntingly familiar. When a community feels threatened by war, economic instability, cultural change, it searches for clarity. Clarity often comes in the form of an enemy, an identifiable cause, a villain. In 1692, that villain was the witch. Today it may be something else, but the psychological pattern remains. Confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret evidence in a way that confirms pre-existing beliefs, ran through every courtroom in Salem. If you already believed witches were attacking the village, every twitch validated your belief. Every scream was proof. Every denial looked rehearsed. Groupthink intensified it. Once community leaders publicly endorsed the trials, dissent became risky. Silence became safer than objection. We see similar patterns in modern media ecosystems. When information circulates within tight ideological circles, it amplifies itself. Accusation spreads faster than verification. Emotion outruns evidence. Salem unfolded in meeting houses and handwritten depositions. Today, similar dynamics can unfold on screens. Instant, amplified, viral. Another modern lens is trauma psychology. Many of the afflicted girls had experienced frontier violence. Their symptoms, fits, visions, panic, may have been expressions of psychological distress in a culture that interpreted trauma spiritually. Without a medical framework for PTSD, their experiences were filtered through theology. The community responded accordingly. Now consider how societies today respond to collective trauma. After terrorist attacks, after economic crashes, after pandemics, there is often a surge in suspicion, a tightening of identity boundaries, a hunger for moral certainty. Salem reminds us how quickly fear can convert into accusation when institutions lack guardrails. But there's another layer that makes Salem distinctly American. The trials happened before the United States existed, before the Constitution, before the Bill of Rights. In a way, Salem is part of America's pre-birth memory. Formative scar. It contributed, indirectly, to the emphasis on due process, evidence standards, and limits on government power. It's not an exaggeration to say that some of America's legal DNA carries a response to Salem. And yet, the phrase witch hunt is still used casually in political rhetoric, often by powerful figures describing investigations into their own conduct. That usage reveals something ironic. In 1692, those accused were largely powerless. Widows, farmers, marginalized women. Calling modern accountability processes witch hunts sometimes inverts the historical reality. Salem teaches that real witch hunts target the vulnerable first, and only stop when power is touched. Historians also remind us of gender. Of the 20 executed, 14 were women. Many were outspoken, economically independent, or socially inconvenient. Salem reflected deep anxieties about female agency in a rigid patriarchal society. That tension has never fully disappeared from history. So what is the hidden truth behind the Salem Witch Trials? It is not that people were foolish. It is not that they were uniquely cruel. It is that they were human. Humans under pressure. Humans certain of their righteousness. Humans trusting institutions that failed to restrain themselves. And perhaps the most unsettling modern parallel is this. No one in Salem believed they were participating in injustice. They believed they were preventing catastrophe. That conviction is what makes moral panic so powerful and so dangerous. Because when fear feels like duty, opposition feels like betrayal. Salem forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. If mass hysteria requires only fear, belief, and institutional reinforcement, are we truly immune? Or are we simply more technologically advanced versions of the same psychology? The Salem Witch Trials are not just a chapter in a history book. They are a mirror, a reminder that justice is fragile, that fear is persuasive, and that certainty, when left unchecked, can be lethal. If this story changed the way you see Salem, or the way you see power, evidence, and belief, then take a moment to reflect on it. Because history is not just about memorizing dates. It's about recognizing patterns. And those patterns don't stay in the past. If you want more deep investigations into the hidden truths behind pivotal moments in American history, from political panics to forgotten conspiracies, from frontier conflicts to courtroom dramas, make sure you stay with us, because the next story might feel just as distant at first, until you realize it isn't. And when you look back at Salem now, you might not see witches. You might see warning signs. Picture Salem one last time. No tourists, no gift shops, no reenactments. Just a cold Massachusetts hill in 1692. Wind moving through bare trees. A rope swaying slightly. A community convinced it was doing the right thing. And somewhere in that silence, a question that never fully disappears. How many injustices begin with absolute certainty? Salem didn't burn witches. It revealed something far more dangerous. What happens when fear becomes evidence and belief becomes law? 3 centuries later, the hill is quiet, but the lesson still speaks.